this is not the kind of anthology we're talking about today, unfortunately, because that'd actually be kind of fun. Maybe Beatles movie anthology? Maybe. Well, maybe not, because we do have a lot of ground to cover. Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Horror Movie Syllabus. My name is Professor Victor, and I'll be your host as we go through all the essential, noteworthy, interesting, and notorious modern horror films. If you're new to the channel, I recommend you check out our introduction video. There's a link to that in the description below, and it'll give you a pretty good idea of what the Horror Movie Syllabus is about. But in short, we take a look at a particular subgenre of horror, and then we pick 3 movies from that subgenre to explore. Today's subgenre is anthology horror movies. And the anthology is a fun one for me. I like these movies quite a bit. Now, if you don't really know what an anthology is, it's generally a collection of short stories, vignettes, short films that are all put together. They usually have some sort of like wraparound story or framework, some sort of explanation for why all of these stories are being assembled together into one movie. But basically, it's a bunch of different short horror films, short horror stories in one movie. And they're a lot of fun by and large. These movies tend to be rather popular, and I think part of the appeal is because they're short stories. They're bite-sized. They're easy to get down, and there's a variety, you know. If you don't like one of the stories, well, in a few minutes, it's going to be over and another one's going to start. You know, it's kind of like a variety pack of candy, you know. If you don't like Reese's peanut butter cups, well, there's a Crunch Bar in there, you know. So I think this also works out rather well for people with shorter attention spans. You know, if a 2-hour horror movie sounds like a bit of a slog, well, try a 10-minute horror movie. That might be a little bit more your speed. And again, there's another one coming right down the pipe. So if you like that one, hopefully you'll like the next one too. And if you don't like that one, well, it's not that long. So I think that's part of the appeal of it. But I also think that part of the appeal of horror anthologies is a theme. When a movie can have a good theme for their anthology, whether it be an overarching theme of subject matter or like the wraparound story that kind of explains why people are seeing what they're seeing on the screen, I think that lends itself to being enjoyable, and more clever, a little bit more appreciated by your audience. I know I feel that way about it. I feel like movies that have a little bit more cohesion to them, a little bit more of a theme or concept behind it, work better for me as anthologies. But I tend to like these movies quite a bit. And for the reasons I think that we're mentioning here, I don't feel like I have a short attention span at all. I don't think that's the case for me at all. But I do like seeing these horror shorts. I do like seeing filmmakers try to do something really interesting in a short amount of time, in a compressed amount of time. I also think that, like I said, that having these wraparound stories or something like that to connect the little vignettes together into some sort of cohesive whole is fun. I think that's neat. I know that these are not as easy to make as they would seem to be. I also like the collaborative aspect of it. I like to see when different filmmakers do the different stories and then they get assembled together and somehow still work together. Sometimes they don't. But I do like all of that. I find these movies to be a lot of fun, and I'm clearly not alone because they tend to be rather popular. There are a lot of horror anthologies out there, and there's no way that we could do justice to all of them. We're going to talk about 3 that are going to make the syllabus today, and I'm going to talk about 3 extra credits, but that's not going to even scratch the surface of how many good ones are out there. So I know I'm going to miss stuff, and I'm counting on you guys in the comments to chime in with the ones that I missed that you think are really, really good. Now, that said, I know we've talked about a few horror anthologies in other subgenres because, again, when they have a cohesive theme, when they have some sort of concept behind them, they wind up being eligible for a different subgenre. So, for example, if they're all holiday themed, they might wind up being talked about in the other holiday subgenre or the Xmas subgenre, depending on what they're about. So I know that other anthologies have been talked about in other subgenres, but these are the ones that I think really exemplify the anthology subgenre for me. These are the ones that hit really well for me. So this is kind of a personal list in the sense that, I mean, the whole syllabus is a personal list. It's all my opinion, really. But in this case, the way I picked these movies was kind of based on like my go-to thoughts when I think of the anthologies that hit for me. And you'll see a lot of this is rooted in nostalgia. Not all of it, but a lot of it's rooted in nostalgia. So as we go forward, I'll point that out, but it'll be pretty obvious, frankly. But the thing about anthologies is when you're comparing them, it's like apples and oranges. Like they're all kind of their own thing. Even the vignettes within the anthologies are kind of oftentimes their own thing. You can compare, this one's good, this one's bad, but it's really kind of hard to make those comparisons. So in terms of organizing them, we will organize them undergraduate, graduate, and postgraduate like we always do. But we're just going to do it in chronological order because I thought that was just the easiest way to go ahead and do this is chronological order, earliest first, latest last, and we'll just move on with it. But let's go ahead and start digging into these anthologies and seeing what makes them so noteworthy. The first anthology that we're looking at today, the undergraduate level selection, is Creepshow. Creepshow came out in 1982 and is noteworthy for a number of reasons, not the least of which is that it's directed by George A. Romero and written by Stephen King in what would turn out to be his first screenwriting job, even though he'd been writing books for quite a while at that point. But there's a number of reasons why Creepshow stands out, and we're going to get into those in just a minute. But if you haven't seen the film, the movie has a wraparound story of a kid reading a comic book, the horror comic book, and his dad is mad at him for reading horror and doesn't want him to read it. And each vignette that we see in the movie is a story from the comic book, and it involves 5 different vignettes ranging from zombie stories to boxed up creatures to insects to aliens from outer space. It runs the gamut in terms of material, but they all seem to go together pretty well with this vignette because they all feel very horror comic-y with a little bit of an ironic twinge in all of the stories. So it works out pretty well, but we won't get too deep into the hijinks specifically so as not to spoil the film for you. Suffice to say, Creepshow hits really well for me because I saw it as a kid. I was probably 7, 8 years old when the movie came out, and I loved it. It really hit home for me. Also, I liked comic books a lot, and the movie is set up as like an homage to the EC comics from the 50s and stuff like that, or even earlier than that actually. The pre-comic code stuff, the Tales from the Crypt and Vault of Horror and things like that. This movie is set up to be kind of an homage to that. And I remember at the time I thought that Creepshow actually was a comic book from that time period, and it's not. But I went looking for it, and I did find like an adaptation of Creepshow in comic book form. I spent like $30 on it as a kid, which my mom thought was insane. And honestly, it didn't really go much in value, so I guess it kind of was insane. But that's a whole other story. We're not here to talk about comic book collecting. We're here to talk about Creepshow, and I think it works really, really well. Now, part of that, of course, is the creative team. George Romero is an excellent director, as we all know, and Stephen King is a good writer. And he's writing for the screen here, and he does a fairly good job of this. Now, some of these vignettes are based on earlier works of King, but I think most of them are actually original works for the movie, and they're good. I like all of the stories, all of the vignettes in here. None of them are clunkers to me. Some I like better than others. The Meteorite one that stars Stephen King actually is maybe with the weaker link to me, although it's kind of funny. The one that hit for me as a kid and to this day still does is the cockroach one. The cockroach one really creeps me out because I don't like bugs. I really don't like cockroaches. I could tell you some horrifying cockroach stories from apartments I've had in the past, but we're not going to get into that because it's all unsettling. But that one, super duper effective for me. Really gets under my skin, no pun intended. It's a gruesome one, but all of the vignettes work for me. The wraparound story works for me. It's got Tom Atkins in it, and the kid is, I think it's actually Stephen King's son who's playing the kid. But I like how it goes from live action to a little bit of animation. It's kind of like comic book style animation. It's all working really well. It's really creative. It's really cleverly done, and I enjoy it very, very much. Like most anthologies, if you don't like one of them, the next one's coming along pretty quickly, but all of these are a little tongue-in-cheek and fun, and none of them overstay their welcome. They're not super short, but they're not terribly long either, and they all kind of hit. They all have that ironic punch that you'd expect from something like a Tales from the Crypt or a Vault of Horror or something like that. So it really thematically is very tight, very cohesive. And it was pretty popular too because they did make a couple of sequels to it. I actually like the second one quite a bit. I know opinions on that vary. I like it quite a bit. There's in particular, the story about the raft really resonated for me as a teenager. I really liked that one. And there's only, I think, 3 vignettes in the second one, so it's not as long as the first one in terms of, or not as much variety as in the first one. I think that might be why some people don't like it as much because, if you don't like one, it's a little while before you get to the next one. But I like all the stories in it. The third one is a little bit more forgettable. I don't remember it very well, but by all accounts, it wasn't very good. Nobody seems to have a very strong feeling about it. Nobody likes it very much. And then they've recently done on Shudder. They've done the Creepshow series, and that's pretty good too. It's very Twilight Zone-esque, and I do love me some Twilight Zone. More on that in a minute. But I like that too. It works out pretty good. So Creepshow has its fans. It has its following. It's never been super huge, super mainstream, but it does have enough of a following to have endured all this time, and I think rightfully so because it's well made, it's enjoyable, it's solid work, it's got a strong theme, a good wraparound, and if you haven't seen it, you should definitely check it out. Like I said, if you don't like one story, another one's coming down the pipe, and that's a motif you're going to hear repeated throughout this video. But I definitely think that Creepshow is one that if you haven't seen it already, you probably should have, and it's definitely worth checking out. The second anthology we're talking about today, the graduate level selection, is Twilight Zone, the movie. Twilight Zone, the movie, came out in 1983, and it was basically a modernized, updated version of various episodes of the television show from the 1950s, which was an anthology television show with various installments of, again, creepy horror stories that had oftentimes an ironic twist to them. And the movie was going to basically incorporate a bunch of those into one film with a wraparound that is a little bit thin, but we'll get into that in just a second. Now, if you haven't seen the movie, it is a collection of mostly remakes of various Twilight Zone episodes. I think there's at least one original story in there. And they're done by various directors, notable directors, including Joe Dante, John Landis, Steven Spielberg, and George Miller. And they are very, very good. If you like Twilight Zone, you'll probably like these quite a bit. But there is also, some interesting things about the movie that maybe don't work out so well for various reasons. But we'll get into that in just a minute. And I don't want to spoil too much of the movie for you. But there is some stuff that we do need to talk about in this movie. Twilight Zone is a movie that hits for me really, really well because of nostalgia. I love the original series. I love the movie. And I have fond memories of the first time I saw this movie. I saw this in theaters when it came out. And my uncle took me and my cousins to go see this movie. And, we like to go see horror films, but, we were children, so we'd get scared and stuff. And we were sitting in the front row because, again, we were kids and we were stupid. And I remember that one of the seats in the front row was the one that was closest to the emergency exit, which was like a little tunnel, very shadowy with like an exit sign there. Really creepy looking. And just the perfect place for a monster to hang out and just like wait to grab you. And nobody wanted to sit by that. And I kind of got like, goaded into sitting in that seat close to the exit, even though I was really freaked out and scared to sit there. I sat there because I didn't want to, admit that I was too scared to sit there. And I remember that distinctly. And I remember seeing the movie and the vignettes hitting for me extremely well. In particular, the story about the little boy who can basically reshape reality. That one really freaked me out when he pulls a rabbit out of the hat. That scared the crap out of me as a kid. But the whole movie worked really, really well. And we just mostly psyched ourselves out about that one and got creeped out about it. So a lot of nostalgia for that movie that, when I watch it now as an adult, most of it's not scary. In fact, the Kick the Can segment that is directed by Spielberg, it's not scary at all. It's very sentimental and rather sweet and interesting. And as a kid, I just kind of was so worked up by that when I kept waiting for the scare to come. It never really does. So I admit that nostalgia fuels a lot of its selection for the syllabus because I do have very fond memories of that movie and that movie-going experience, and also of the show in general. Like I said, most of these are remakes of episodes from the show, very good episodes from the show. Although they couldn't get Talking Tina in there. It's like my favorite Twilight Zone episode. They couldn't get that one in there. I remember even as a kid being bummed out that they didn't do a remake of the Talking Tina episode. But they did the Terror at 30,000 Feet. They did the Kick the Can. They did a couple of different episodes that were noteworthy, famous Twilight Zone episodes, and they did them well, and they had good directors behind them. I mean, Steven Spielberg was doing this, George Miller, good directors, Joe Dante. Okay, but the one we got to talk about is John Landis, and the reason we got to talk about it is because of the Twilight Zone tragedy. And so to get into it, there is a segment. I think it might be the first segment of the movie that is it's set partly in Vietnam. It's a commentary on racism, and this guy keeps going through various wars and stuff like that. He goes through World War II and stuff like that. But at one point, he's in the Vietnam War, and there was a scene filmed with the actor Vic Morrow, who was famous at the time, and two Vietnamese children, and there was a helicopter accident, and they were killed in this helicopter accident. And it was a huge tragedy and a controversy because these kids were kind of illegally hired. They really weren't adhering to child labor laws and stuff like that. So there was a lot of controversy, and John Landis took a lot of heat for that. Godoff didn't get into any real trouble, which in and of itself is a bit of an issue, but it colors the entire movie. I know there are people who can't even watch the movie because of this tragedy, and I get that. I think that's a very valid position to take. Now, again, for me, this movie connects to something in my childhood, so I have fond memories of it. And the controversy kind of exists as a separate thing, although there was a documentary on Shudder, a series documentary called Cursed Films, that talked about this tragedy in this movie, and they actually have the footage, which I did not think existed. And they show it. Wildly disturbing, and it's just it's a sad thing, and I can see why that throws some people off. I still chose it for the syllabus because, again, of my personal affection for it, but I can understand why some people have an issue with the movie. Other people might just have an issue with the movie because they don't like it as much. Like, if you don't have an affection for Twilight Zone and that kind of storytelling, this movie might not hit as well for you. And I'll admit that the wraparound for this one is pretty thin. It's basically these two paramedics, and they're having a conversation and talking about scary movies. It's very thin. It doesn't do much. It's not amazing. It's definitely not as good as Creepshow in terms of a theme, a cohesive theme. The theme is Twilight Zone. The theme is a bunch of episodes from Twilight Zone. So again, if you like Twilight Zone, this is going to work for you. If you don't, it might not. And of course, if the controversy colors things for you and it kind of puts you off of it, that's fine, man. That's cool. I respect that. But for me, Twilight Zone works. Let me know your thoughts on Twilight Zone, the movie, or the series for that matter, because I love talking about the series. But you'll know nobody made a sequel to this one, so it was what it was. I don't think it was necessarily not a hit, but it didn't have legs, and maybe because of the controversy. But I'd like to know what your thoughts are down in the comments below. And the last anthology we're talking about today, the postgraduate level selection, is VHS. VHS came out in 2012 and is a found footage horror anthology with the idea that the found footage tapes, or VHS tapes, hence the title of the movie, have been discovered, and that's what you're viewing, are people viewing these various tapes under mysterious circumstances. And like most anthology movies, there is some of this works better than others, and the wraparound has its pros and has its cons, but we'll get into all of that in just a minute. If you're not familiar with it, the wraparound story is a group of thugs who like to film themselves doing various small crimes on camera, and they get hired by somebody to break into a house and steal a particular videotape. And when they get in there, they find a dead body and a whole stack of videotapes, and then they start to watch them, and the videotapes have very weird, horrific things on them, and that's what we, the viewers, are seeing as they're seeing them too. And we periodically go back to that wraparound story as the movie goes on, and it starts to make less and less sense. But we won't get into too many of the details because I don't want to spoil anything for anybody. I don't want to spoil too many of the hijinks, but VHS is a tremendous amount of fun, and it really hit well for me. And it's weird because it's really no better than a lot of the other anthologies that were coming out around the time, but I think the found footage aspect of it really hit for me because I do like found footage quite a bit. We've talked about found footage movies in other videos, and it tends to be a format that works well for me. When done well, it's really, really good. Now, is it really done well in this movie? Yes and no. Like any anthology, some segments do it better and some segments don't do it as well. But for the most part, I think it works pretty well. I like most of the anthology vignettes or installments here. There's one that's a little bit clunkier for me, but the glitchy killer, that one doesn't work as well for me, unfortunately. But the first one about the succubus, fantastic. Love that one. I love the one about the newlywed couple that's getting stalked. That one works really well. The cult one works really well. Most of these work really well, and the found footage aspect of it works well too. It adds something to the story. Seeing it from the point of view character is adding something to it. And I think that's what maybe set VHS apart from some of the other anthologies for me, was that POV aspect of having a person right into it. The wraparound story doesn't work as well for me. I don't find the characters likable, and I don't think you're supposed to. And as the vignettes go on, the wraparound concept makes less and less sense from a narrative perspective, because the technology, the VHS technology, is dated. And it was dated at the time of the movie was released, and so some of the stuff that you're seeing on these tapes doesn't make sense that it would be on a VHS tape. Now, my friend Josh over at Movie Timelines has gone into this in far more detail, and I'll leave a link to his video on the subject matter in the description below. So he's kind of touched on this a lot more, but he's absolutely right that as the sequels of this movie go on, they don't make much sense, and you have to just kind of start accepting that there's a supernatural aspect to the films, which to me kind of ruins the concept or the wraparound, and so it loses some style points for me on that one. But the vignettes themselves mostly work really well, partly because they've got some really great talent there too. You've got Adam Wingard and Simon Barrett. You've got Ty West, my guy Ty West. There's some good talent making good stuff. And then the sequels, there are other new other directors that are doing things really well too. The second one I liked quite a bit. In fact, arguably like the second one better than the first one. The vignettes might be across the board better. And the third one, it got a little stale to me by the third one. There's also a spin-off movie called Siren that's a spin-off of the first vignette from the first movie, which is really good. The succubus one, really good. So I recommend that. But there's a diminishing returns, I guess, eventually as they keep going to this well, and the more they go to it, the less the concept makes sense, the less the technology makes sense, and you just kind of have to roll with that, because the actual stories themselves are mostly really good. And once again, if you don't like one, another one's coming down the pipe right away, so you don't have to get too worked up about it. It thematically doesn't really hold together very well, aside from the idea that they're all found footage. But that was enough for me. That's enough for me to enjoy it, enough for me to keep invested into it. But like I said, if I watch too many of these in a row, it starts to wear me out a little bit. So I don't think that the center doesn't hold very well for the series. But the first one I like quite a bit. The second one I like quite a bit. After that, the spin-off's good. But you can see where like these are really good vignettes by really good directors, but you could also argue that their full-length version movies are better than what you're seeing here. And I wouldn't argue with that. If people were to say, hey, Ty West does a lot better work not in VHS, I would have to be agreed. Adam Wingard, same thing. His full-length horror movies better than what you got here. But I like them. I like the movies. I like the vignettes, the stories. I think they work rather well. If you like found footage, chances are you've already seen VHS, but if you haven't, you're probably going to like this one quite a bit. But even if you don't like found footage, unless you hate found footage, I would say still check this one out, because I do think they're well made. I do think they're fun. I do think that while it's clearly low budget, it still works out to be very effective. The scares work really well. The footage looks good. The found footage kind of covers up some of the budget issues. So I think it works out pretty good. And I would say that these little vignettes end better than most found footage movies, because that's always a caveat with found footage movies. They never seem to have a good ending. They always kind of just end in kind of the same way. And not that these don't, but I feel like the endings tend to be a little bit more satisfying because they're shorter, they don't overstay their welcome. And so the fact they end quicker seems to make sense. It seems to work out pretty good. So I think that the short anthology vignette style is actually a boon for found footage. I think it works out pretty good for that. But overall, I just think this is a well-made movie. I guess it was produced by Bloody Disgusting. They got good talent there. They were hungry young guys at the time. And it shows. They came here to do something cool, and I think they did it. And I think it's mostly successful. Like most anthologies, not 100% successful, but more good than bad. So if you haven't seen VHS, and unless you hate found footage, definitely recommend you check it out. And I'm sure a lot of you have seen it. So if you have thoughts, let us know in the comments below. In particular, I'd like to know which installment was your favorite from the movie. So let's talk about that when we get down to the comments. So that's going to do it for our exploration into horror anthologies. But if you like these movies like I do, then there's a few extra credit ones we want to get into. Like I said, there's so many of these to choose from, but these are just three that I chose again because these are ones that I tend to really, really like. The first one I'm going to mention is a movie called Cat's Eye. And Cat's Eye came out in 1985, and it's a Stephen King movie. It's based on stories for Stephen King. I think, again, another one that's a new Stephen King original for this movie. And it stars Drew Barrymore, and it's got a cat theme running throughout. So you know Professor Victor's going to be interested in this one. If you haven't seen it before, the movie has basically three stories that, again, are connected by this tomcat who is going on various adventures. He kind of pops up in each vignette and winds up leading you from one story to the other. Otherwise, these stories don't really connect very well. But honestly, the cat wraparound worked for me because I like cats. All three of the stories are pretty good. The first one, Quitters Inc., about the mob running a company that helps you quit smoking, is pretty creepy, pretty unsettling. I like that one quite a bit. The second one, The Ledge, about the guy who is trying to get his wife's lover to walk out on a ledge, is less interesting to me, but it's not bad. It's not a bad time. And then the third one, General, about the little girl, little Drew Barrymore, who I love, finding the cat, the tomcat, and naming him General, and him rescuing her from an evil troll that comes out to try to steal her breath at night, is fantastic. If you've ever wanted to see a little troll fighting a cat, and who doesn't, this is the movie for you. I love this movie. Now, again, I have a lot of nostalgia for it. I loved it as a kid. It really hit home for me. That little troll freaked me out as a kid. I loved the cat. All of this worked for me really well as a kid, but I would argue that it holds up pretty well. Like there's not a lot of ton of special effects. Like it really hasn't aged poorly. I think that the irony in these little vignettes, these little stories, work really well. The creepiness works really well. It's not super scary. Again, I saw this as a kid, and it didn't really even scare me as a kid. There's not a whole lot of scare going on. It's really a lot of more of like unsettling feelings and like tongue-in-cheek irony and just the kind of like creepy, off-putting stories. But it works really, really well. It's classic Stephen King stuff, and it's done very, very well. This is a movie that hasn't really got the reputation that I would think it would have. It didn't have any sequels or anything like that. But I think people who have seen it seem to have a fond memory of it. I wouldn't go so far as to call it a cult classic, but I do think that when I talk to people who have seen it, they seem to be fans of it. So if you haven't seen it, I would definitely check it out. If you like, horror anthologies, it's only got three stories, so they're a little bit longer than your average, vignette from a horror anthology. But they're definitely worth checking out if you haven't seen it before. So, Cat's Eye, check it out if you haven't. The second extra credit movie I'm going to mention is a movie called ABCs of Death. The ABCs of Death came out in 2012, and when this movie came out, I really, really liked this movie. I was really into it. It seemed to kind of just hit a sweet spot for me, and I'm not 100% sure why, but I'd say most of the vignettes worked for me. A few of them didn't, but I was really, really into this movie when I first saw it. But revisiting it for this video, I liked it less, and I'm not 100% sure why, but we're going to try to figure that out as we talk about this a little bit. If you haven't seen it before, the movie is 26 different short horror films, each based on a different letter of the alphabet, and each having something to do with the theme of death. So it's kind of a loose theme, and it's a bunch of different filmmakers with a very loose marching orders. And as a result, the movie maybe doesn't feel super cohesive, but there are enough films that they are all very, very short. They're all just like 3, 4, 5 minutes. So if you don't like one, another one's coming right away. But we won't spoil too many of the details in case you haven't seen the movie. And if you haven't seen the movie, I do think it's worth a watch. But like I was saying, when I rewatched it, I was surprised that I had less patience for some of the stories than I had the first time I watched it. My memory was that I liked the vast majority of these vignettes. And I'd say now maybe it's more like 50-50. a lot of them didn't hit as well as I remembered them hitting. Some of them are just crass, simple jokes. Some of them just don't feel all that original, and some of them just aren't that well made. But the ones that are good are very good. And some of that's going to be due to the fact that they've got some bona fide talent making these movies. Again, you've got Adam Wingard, you've got Simon Barrett, you've got Ty West, you got Nacho Vigalondo. Some of these guys were the ones that were doing VHS, and so they're doing different vignettes here. And they are good filmmakers. There's a lot of good filmmakers here. But again, not every vignette works for me. And, like I say, when one doesn't work, there's another one coming down the pipe. But if you get 3 or 4 or 5 clunker vignettes in a row, it can start to wear you down. It can start to make the movie feel not that good. And that was my experience with it recently, was that I felt like there were a couple of clunkers in a row, but then one would come along that was a little bit more imaginative, a little bit more fun, and it would bring me back into it. So it never fully lost me. I just remembered it being better than I actually think it is now. And I don't know why that is. I don't know if it's because I've seen more anthologies since this one came out 10 years ago, and so these don't feel as fresh, or because I've seen it already and so it didn't feel as fresh, or maybe it's because, rewatching it for this video and talking about, having a good wraparound and having a solid cohesive theme, this one really doesn't. And so maybe that was part of why I was a little bit looking at things askance, was that, the theme is very thin. It's just an alphabet theme. They assign everybody a letter of the alphabet and say, go make a movie, choose a word that starts with this letter that has something to do with death. And some of them are kind of strained. And sometimes that's funny. Sometimes the strain that they had to make a connection between the connection, to death and to their letter is kind of a funny thing. It's kind of a tongue-in-cheek thing when you try to guess what the letter is that they're doing when you watch the movie, because they don't tell the letter till the end. That's fun. But sometimes it just kind of makes you roll your eyes. And I found myself doing that more than I expected to. There is a sequel to this. They did a second one, ABCs of Death 2. And I remember even at the time thinking that one was less good than the original. I didn't revisit that one for this video. And I'd be reluctant to now, because I have a feeling that if I liked the original less than I did before, the sequel probably, that doesn't bode well for the sequel. But again, 26 vignettes, you're bound to like some of them. I just remember thinking that the ratio was off for that one, that there's fewer good ones than bad ones in that one. Less than a 50-50 ratio for me on that one. But again, neither of these are a bad time. I originally liked the first one quite a bit. And I'm wondering if I were to revisit again, in a while, not thinking about, wraparounds and themes and concepts and cohesion, if I would be able to just enjoy the shorts on their own, or if I just watch a couple of them, like for YouTube or something like that, maybe I'd enjoy it again a little bit more, because I do think that when it hits the highs, they're high, and the lows are not that bad. But I guess I'm saying, ABCs of Death, maybe not for everybody. Maybe not the cream of the crop, but I still have an affection for it because of that first viewing. Even though I'm kind of doubting that first viewing now, I still wanted to keep it on here as extra credit. If you guys have seen this, let me know what you think. Do you have high opinion of this? Do you think it falls short? Did you have the experience I had where you thought it was really good and then rewatching it doesn't seem like it holds up? Let me know in the comments below, because I'd really like to solve that mystery. And the last horror anthology extra credit we're going to talk about is Trilogy of Terror. Trilogy of Terror came out in 1975 and is kind of a beloved horror anthology. It was a made-for-TV movie directed by Dan Curtis, everybody's favorite Dark Shadows creator. And it seems like people remember this one very fondly. I'm one of those. I mentioned earlier about nostalgia. This is one of those movies where I think nostalgia really plays a key part into people's opinion of this one. But we're going to get into all of that in just a second. If you haven't seen it before, Trilogy of Terror is a trilogy of vignettes, all starring Karen Black. She stars as the lead character in each of the 3 stories, and all 3 of the stories are based on Richard Matheson works. Richard Matheson of I Am Legend fame, and that's really the only connection between the 3. Otherwise, they're really like ABCs of Death, not a really strong through line. There really not a lot of connection between the movies, the stories, other than Karen Black. But we won't spoil too much of the movie, other than to say what each of the vignettes is about. But the first 2 vignettes are somewhat forgettable. Again, each one stars Karen Black, and the first one is not bad. It's got a pretty good twist to it, but it doesn't make a tremendous amount of sense. In this day and age, the subject matter of it is a little uncomfortable, as it's kind of talking a little bit about some sexual assault, stuff like that. But then the ending kind of flips it on its head. Questionable about the message it's trying to send. It's obviously just trying to go for a twist, but the twist kind of changes the narrative a little bit. And of course, I'm dancing around it and not spoil it too much, but it really does kind of complicate things a little bit, but it's not bad. It's pretty good. And I didn't see the twist coming, so that was pretty good. The second one, I see the twist coming a mile away. It's about two twin sisters who have some animosity to each other, and if the movie had better makeup, maybe they could have pulled off this twist a little bit better. And I'm probably spoiling it just from talking about it or showing a clip from it, because it's not that hard to figure out. It just isn't. The twist is so obvious that I was surprised more that they tried to make that a twist and didn't just like tackle it head on and try to go somewhere else with it. But they really don't. That's just it. That's the twist. And it's a little bit disappointing. The reason people love this movie is for the third story, and that is the Zuni fetish doll, where Karen Black plays a woman who has bought this, arguably offensive Zuni fetish doll for her boyfriend as a gift, and the fetish doll comes alive and attacks her, and it's amazing. It's absolutely amazing. Now, I saw this as a kid, like so many of us did. Love that last one. That's the memorable thing. That's the thing that stuck with me as a kid. But the interesting thing was rewatching it for this video, because I think it holds up. They shoot around the doll so it doesn't look too ridiculous. They don't have the technology that you would have years later for things like Child's Play, for Chucky and stuff like that. They didn't have the ability to do that kind of stuff back then. So they're really kind of shooting around the doll when it's running around and stuff like that. So you don't see the seams. You don't see how silly it actually looks. And that is actually really effective. And then Karen Black really goes for it. She really sells it. She really goes out of her way to make this believable, goes all out for this. It's a ridiculous performance that totally works. She really goes all in, and it's a lot of fun. The design of the doll is fantastic. It really actually is kind of creepy, especially for a child. If you're seeing this as a kid, it really is very effective. But even as an adult, you kind of think, oh, it would be so easy to beat this thing. But when you see this, you're like, maybe not. Like, this thing's pretty relentless, and then it's got a great ending. So the Zuni fetish doll is, for a good reason, why people find this so beloved, why people remember this one, why it's endured, is basically for that last story. And I'm one of those people. I'm on board with that. It deserves mention just for that. I almost put this one on the syllabus proper, and the only reason I did is because, again, the first two vignettes kind of weak, and the wraparound, the concept, kind of weak. It's just that Zuni fetish doll and Karen Black. She's good in the whole movie. They did make a TV sequel to this. I haven't seen that one before. I've never even heard about anything. I didn't even know about it until I did some research for this. But anybody out there know anything about this TV sequel? Has anybody seen it? It didn't sound like anything that sounded tremendously noteworthy or worth my trouble to try to track down. But let me know if I'm wrong on that. If you think it's good, tell me to check it out. But I didn't think it would be as good as the Zuni fetish doll. So that was, that was the thing about the first one, is that doll is amazing. And I have a feeling a lot of you have fond memories of it too. Let us know in the comments below. What did you think of Trilogy of Terror? But if you haven't seen it, at least watch that last segment. It's definitely worth your time. So that's going to do it for our exploration into horror anthologies. Like I said, there are so many great ones out there, some of which we've talked about in other videos in the horror movie syllabus, some of which we talked about here, many of which I've left on the table. So in the comments below, hit me up. Tell me which horror anthologies you think are the best ones. What makes your syllabus? Which ones did I not talk about that I should have? Which ones do you think are better than the ones I've mentioned? Why do they hit for you? Tell us all that in the comments below. I'm looking forward to engaging you on that, because there's a lot to still talk about in horror anthologies. But now, let's switch the conversation over to Horror Trivia Pursuit. Now's the time where I like to look at a Trivia Pursuit card and try to answer a question live on camera. And we're going to go with, let's go with the psychological category. Why not? Because a lot of the movies talked about here have a psychological aspect to it. So, psychological question here is, what is the name of the recurring diner in 2001's Mulholland Drive? This is going to be an embarrassing week for me, isn't it? Because I don't know the answer to this question. I just don't know it. I know Mulholland Drive, and we will actually talk about Mulholland Drive in the future, probably in a few months. I love that movie. I love me some David Lynch. I've talked about David Lynch a little bit before. Um, but I do not remember the diner's name at all. I remember the famous diner scene. I remember they go around the back of the diner, the jump scare that's there. I remember that very clearly. That's one of the most memorable scenes in the entire movie. But I have no idea what the diner's name is. I don't even remember it being recurring, to be honest with you. It's been a minute since I've seen Mulholland Drive. So I'm feeling a little bit embarrassed calling myself a David Lynch fan and not knowing the answer to this question. But I'm still going to take a stab at it. I'm giving you guys some time to think about it too, in case you want to take a stab. And I've got my idea for what my stab is going to be, and I'll explain my logic to you in a minute. But just going once, going twice, lock in your answer now, and I'm going to start telling you what I'm thinking. I'm going to guess the name of a real diner, because Mulholland Drive is a real street in LA, and I live in Southern California, so I'm familiar with this, and I'm familiar with a particular diner, a chain of diners that's very famous in LA, and so that's what I'm going to go with. I'm going to go with Mel's Diner. That is going to be my pick because that is a pretty well-known diner in LA, and since this was dealing with real places, I think that that would make some sense. I honestly don't remember if it is, but it looks like a Mills Diner, so that would make sense to me. And maybe my hope is that somewhere in the back of my head, I actually have this knowledge, like it's rattling around in my subconscious, and that's why I'm going with Mills Diner. That's my hope. Let's find out if I'm right. Is it Mills Diner? No, it's Winkies. And the second I read Winkies on this card, I remembered not remembering it from the movie, but I remember because I've watched, I watch YouTube videos, other people talking about horror and stuff like that, and I watched a video about Mulholland Drive. It's been a few months since I watched that video, but I remember them talking about Winkies. I remember that now because I remember thinking, oh, that's the name of the diner. Because again, it's just not something that stuck with me when I watched the movie. And those of you who watch the channel know I'm terrible when it comes to names. Usually names of characters, but names of establishments, same thing. I'm not really good at remembering names of things, so that's kind of an Achilles heel when it comes to these things. But yeah, Winkies. I remember that being mentioned in somebody else's YouTube video. If I can remember the video, I'd put a link to it, but I don't remember. It's been months since I watched that, but. I failed. I am a fake David Lynch fan. Let me have it in the comments. Did you guys get this? If not, did you guess Mel's Diner like I did? Did you use the same deductive reasoning as I did? Or did you have another answer? Was it a funny answer? Let us know in the comments below. Wrong answers only. But I hope you got it right. And I hope you enjoyed today's video. I hope you enjoy anthologies because I do. A lot of people do. That's why they're so popular. Again, let me know in the comments what good ones we missed. We'll talk about that, and we'll talk about anything else you want to talk about in the comments. Next week, we'll be talking about something a little bit different. But until then, class dismissed.